Right under our noses, a quiet, but honestly massive revolution in global power has just taken place. And the crazy thing? It wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with agendas, policies, and a really strategic four-year alliance that is actively shifting control of the global economy completely away from the West. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a fascinating structural shift in international relations, the rise of the global South, and how they are redefining global governance. For decades, developing nations basically just had to follow the rules set by a handful of wealthy countries. But recently, they decided it was time to start making the rules themselves.
Okay, so let's dive right in. We're going to unpack this massive shift into 5 quick chapters. We'll start with the Old World Order, move from rule takers to rule makers, look at the poly-crisis and new ideas, then rewiring international finance, and finally, obstacles to lasting transformation.
Chapter 1. The Old World Order. The 1944 Blueprint. Think about the global architecture we've lived in for nearly 8 decades. Back in 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank were created. And, they really reflected the reality of that specific time. North America and Western Europe completely dominated global production and finance. It was, for all intents and purposes, a Western-built boardroom. But fast forward to the 2020s, and we live in a drastically different, multipolar world. Emerging economies, places like India, China, and Brazil, they now drive an increasingly massive share of global GDP, manufacturing, and population growth. So the central argument we're exploring today is really just this. The current system was built for a world that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Chapter 2. From Rule Takers to Rule Makers. The Global South steps up.
Historically, annual G20 presidencies produced really fragmented priorities. Basically, every year, a new host country would come in and emphasize a completely different issue. But from 2022 to 2025, something totally different happened. We saw a strategic quad presidency coalition. Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa held the G20 presidency back-to-back. And instead of treating their presidencies as these isolated, one-off events, they consciously embedded long-term priorities over 4 years. Indonesia pushed health and digital transformation. Then India advanced digital infrastructure and bank reforms. Brazil focused on inequality and climate. And now South Africa is carrying the torch for debt and industrialization. This uninterrupted bloc effectively created a policy coalition. It literally forced the world to pay sustained attention to the issues of the developing world.
But here's the crucial point. This wasn't just about setting the agenda. It was about changing who actually gets a seat at the table. In 2023, during India's presidency, the African Union secured permanent membership in the G20. Really think about what that means. We're talking about 55 countries, 1.5 billion people, an economy exceeding $3 trillion. This isn't just some symbolic diplomacy. This is 1/5 of humanity finally getting a permanent voting seat in the ultimate economic boardroom of the world. Because, let's be real, global rules on climate, food, and debt are simply more legitimate when the states most affected are actually there to help design them.
Moving to Chapter 3. The Poly-Crisis and New Ideas. Redefining Global Threats.
Now, advanced economies usually view global governance through the lens of geopolitical competition and security, right? But the developing world shifted the spotlight to everyday, interconnected economic threats. They championed a really interesting concept called the poly-crisis. Basically, this is a scenario where multiple crises, think inflation, crippling debt, climate disasters, food insecurity, all happen at the exact same time, and they reinforce each other. For billions of people, these aren't just separate problems sitting in neat little boxes. They're a massive, tangled web that actively constrains their development.
Let's walk through how this domino effect actually plays out in the real world, and why, say, a decision made in Washington impacts a classroom in Nairobi. Okay, step 1. The U.S. raises its interest rates to fight its own domestic inflation. Step 2. Because of this, the U.S. dollar gets stronger globally. Step 3. Now, developing nations whose debt is often priced in dollars suddenly find that their foreign currency debt is way more expensive to pay back, which leads to step 4, the tragic conclusion. To afford these higher debt payments, developing governments are literally forced to slash budgets for health, schools, and climate adaptation. So fiscal policy made in the West directly defunds basic infrastructure in the developing world. It's a brutal cycle.
But the Global South isn't just pointing out problems. They're actually offering some brilliant new ideas to fix them. Enter Digital Public Infrastructure, or DPI. This was heavily championed during India's presidency. Instead of relying on private, corporate-controlled platforms, DPI creates publicly accessible systems for digital identity and payments. It's a fascinating alternative development model. It expands financial inclusion and lowers transaction costs for millions of people. And the best part? You don't have to hand over the keys to a Silicon Valley monopoly to do it.
Which brings us to Chapter 4, Rewiring International Finance, Updating the 1944 Architecture. There is a massive structural disadvantage that developing nations face when it comes to debt. Think about this. Advanced economies get to borrow in their own currencies, dollars, yen, euros, so they face very little exchange rate risk. Developing nations, they absolutely don't have that luxury. Investors basically force them to borrow in dollars. So if their local currency drops in value against the dollar, their debt magically becomes so much more expensive to pay off. And that happens even if they haven't borrowed a single extra cent. The Global South is arguing, understandably, that this structural asymmetry is inherently unfair and absolutely needs fixing.
And they actually have a concrete plan to fix it. Let's break down their three-pronged attack on this outdated financial architecture. First up, multilateral development banks, or MDBs, like the World Bank. The old method uses highly conservative capital rules. The proposed reform just makes some modest risk adjustments. That alone could unlock hundreds of billions of dollars for climate and infrastructure without even needing massive new donor funds. It's a game changer. Second, we have IMF's special drawing rights, which are essentially international reserve assets. Under the old method, wealthy nations automatically get the most, even though they literally need it the least. The reform here is to channel $100 billion of those unused reserves directly toward vulnerable countries. And finally, sovereign debt. The old Paris Club method only focused on Western lenders, but today, China and private investors hold massive amounts of debt. So the new G20 Common Framework tries to bring absolutely everyone, including China and private bondholders, to the table for coordinated restructuring.
Chapter 5, Obstacles to Lasting Transformation, the Reality Check.
Okay, so it all sounds great, but let's be realistic for a second. First, we have what's known as the consensus constraint. See, the G20 isn't like the UN. It possesses no formal legal charter and has absolutely no enforcement authority. It relies entirely on unanimous political consensus. And, well, if you've been following global news at all, you know that unanimous consensus is incredibly hard to find right now, especially with intensifying strategic competition between the US and China, not to mention various regional conflicts. Basically, when polarization goes up, the ability to actually pass these ambitious institutional reforms goes way, way down.
Furthermore, it is so vital to remember that the Global South is not a monolith. It's an incredibly diverse group of nations. You have countries with strong state-led economies trying to negotiate alongside those pushing for market liberalization. You've got major fossil fuel exporters sitting right next to highly climate-vulnerable island nations. They have wildly different stances on trade rules, industrial policy, and geopolitical alignments. So, as you can imagine, this incredible internal diversity makes it super complicated to maintain a unified, coherent negotiating coalition on every single issue.
Another massive roadblock is just the sheer proliferation of competing institutions. The G20 isn't the only game in town anymore. We're seeing the rise of the expanded BRICS Plus grouping, various regional development banks, and totally new bilateral financing mechanisms. And while these alternative institutions can definitely be helpful, they also risk fragmenting diplomatic attention. When there are too many overlapping institutions, international economic cooperation can actually become more complicated. It kind of chips away at the G20's ability to act as the central coordinator for all of this. Which brings us to the ultimate cliffhanger for the future of global governance. After 4 consecutive years of the Global South setting the agenda, the United States is going to assume the G20 presidency for the 2026 cycle. This leads to the million-dollar question. Will the Global North preserve this momentum on debt reform, climate finance, and inclusive governance? Or will they push back against this new multipolar reality? The Global South has successfully proven that the future of global governance simply cannot ignore the developing world anymore. But the true test of this quiet revolution is honestly just beginning. So, who really gets to write the rules of the 21st century? Thank you for exploring this with me today, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.